Almost 100 days have passed since that morning that split time in two. Since September 11th, 2025, the name of Yu Menglong ceased to belong to the present and began to settle in an uncomfortable zone of collective memory. Officially, the case was closed with speed. In the official statements, there were no loose ends. There were no more questions to formulate. However, for thousands of people, the administrative silence did not signify an end, but rather the beginning of a persistent unease. In many East Asian traditions, the 100th day after death is not just any date. It represents the moment when weeping should stop and the living should continue on their path. It is also the symbolic instant in which the soul crosses a definitive threshold, moving away from the earthly world. The paradox, in the case of Yu Menglong, is that just when that limit seemed to be reached, the conversation was only beginning. From Taiwan to Thailand, and later in Malaysia, spontaneous commemoration ceremonies emerged. These were not acts organized by institutions or official campaigns. They were gatherings of ordinary people who lit lamps, offered flowers, fruits, and small everyday objects that recalled the artist's tastes. In caves, temples, and public spaces, his image appeared surrounded by prayers. Those encounters did not speak solely of loss. They expressed a shared sense of moral debt, as if the farewell had remained incomplete. The most striking scene occurred when, alongside the name of Yu Menglong, appeared another that many believed buried in the past, Qiao Renliang. Two different names, two stories separated by years, now united in a single act of remembrance. For some, it was a coincidence laden with symbolism. For others, a disturbing sign that certain patterns deserved to be observed with greater attention. No one asserted certainties. What grew was discomfort. As the days passed, users from different platforms began to review old archives with almost obsessive patience. Songs, interviews, photographs, apparently harmless recordings. Minimal details, previously ignored, began to acquire new meanings. A subtle change in a lyric. A gesture captured in a short video. An image that generated more questions than answers. None of this constituted conclusive evidence, but together it formed a constellation difficult to ignore. This is not a tale of tributes, nor an exercise in nostalgia. Neither is it a direct accusation. It is an attempt to understand why, even after 100 days, so many people refuse to close this chapter. What drives a dispersed community to sustain attention when the rest of the world seems to have turned the page? What unease remains when the official version fails to calm the collective conscience? Behind the glamour, the contracts, and the stage lights, there exists an industry that is rarely observed head-on. And it is there, in that opaque space, where many believe the keys to understanding why the story of Yu Menglong continues to resonate are hidden. In the following minutes, we will analyze every layer of this case, not to dictate sentences, but to examine how power, silence, and memory function in the world of contemporary entertainment. From the moment the commemorative ceremonies multiplied, attention ceased to focus solely on the physical absence of Yu Menglong. The focus shifted, almost inevitably, toward a more uncomfortable question. What were his final years really like within the industry that had brought him to fame? For many observers, the pain did not come only from the loss, but from the feeling that something essential had remained hidden for too long. The first element that captured the collective attention was a seemingly harmless musical interpretation. Yu Menglong had covered the song Encounter, a well-known and widely listened to track. For years, that recording went unnoticed, integrated into the vast archive of content of a young artist. However, after his death, some listeners began to listen to it again, this time with minute, almost surgical attention. It was then that the doubt arose. A keyline did not sound exactly the same as the original version. From a technical point of view, the difference might seem minimal. In singing, certain phonemes approximate naturally. The nasalization of a syllable or the position of the tongue can alter the listener's perception without a conscious intention. Nevertheless, for those who reviewed the recording again and again, the variation acquired a symbolic weight. The phrase ceased to express an abstract resignation in the face of destiny, and began to suggest a more concrete, almost personal impossibility of deciding for oneself. This change, real or perceived, activated a deeper debate on the use of art as an indirect channel of expression. Throughout history, numerous creators have resorted to metaphors, ambiguities, or nuances to communicate that which they could not say openly. In contexts where direct words can be dangerous or inconvenient, art becomes a refuge. The question in this case is not whether Yu Menglong deliberately modified a lyric, but why so many people are willing to believe that he needed to do so. The answer seems to lie in the public image that was built over time. Yu Menglong was frequently described as a docile, careful figure, little prone to conflict. That perception, far from reassuring, fueled the suspicion of vulnerability. In a highly hierarchical environment like that of entertainment, the lack of confrontation is not always a free choice. Sometimes it's a survival strategy. To this reading were added other audiovisual materials. In one of them, recorded during an encounter with followers, Yu Menglong is seen signing autographs meticulously, without haste. Suddenly, a hand appears on the scene and grabs him by the arm, interrupting the gesture. The scene lasts only a few seconds. There is no visible struggle or audible words. However, the body language is eloquent for those who analyze it a posteriori. The body tenses, the smile fades, and the action stops. Again, this is not conclusive evidence. In the professional sphere, times are regulated and representatives usually intervene to comply with strict agendas. But the emotional impact of the video lies in its context. Observed in isolation, it may seem trivial. Inserted into a narrative of prolonged control, it transforms into a symbol of constant limitation, even in acts as simple as thanking followers. The accumulation of these details led to a broader reflection on the degree of real autonomy of young artists. Extensive contracts, restrictive clauses, and economic dependency relationships can create a sense of confinement that is not always perceived from the outside. For the public, fame is associated with freedom and privilege. For those who live within the system, it can become an invisible cage. The analysis of this first level does not seek to establish guilt or formulate definitive accusations. Its objective is to understand why the official account is insufficient for a significant part of the audience. When an entire community feels the need to reinterpret songs, gestures, and silences, it is not solely due to morbid curiosity. It is because they perceive a dissonance between the public image and the human experience they intuit behind it. Here, a fundamental question arises. How much freedom does an individual retain when their career, their image, and their decisions are mediated by interests other than their own? In the case of Yu Menglong, this question became central after his death, but it reflects a broader concern that affects an entire generation of artists. The conversation, therefore, no longer revolves solely around a specific figure. It becomes a mirror of an industry that rewards obedience and punishes silent dissent. Every detail analysed, every alternative interpretation, speaks of a collective desire to understand the limits of power and the fragility of those who seem to have it all. The story is only beginning to unfold, and while the questions multiply, an inevitable reflection remains open. If art was, at some point, the only space where Yu Menglong could hint at his truth, how many other similar truths remain hidden behind melodies, smiles, and carefully edited scenes? When the first alternative interpretations began to circulate, the conversation ceased to be intimate and passed into becoming a collective phenomenon. What were initially isolated reflections transformed into an avalanche of shared analyses, cross-comments, and public reconstructions. In a matter of days, the name of Yu Menglong reappeared with force in digital spaces that, until then, seemed to have forgotten him. The video in which the interruption during the autograph signing is observed became one of the main triggers. Reproduced thousands of times, slowed down frame by frame, analysed from multiple angles, it went from being a casual recording to a symbolic object. For some, it represented a simple logistical intervention. For others, it embodied a disturbing metaphor, the impossibility of deciding even the smallest gestures in the face of those who decide for you. This process of reinterpretation did not occur in a vacuum. It was fueled by a prior sensation, difficult to define but widely shared, that Yu Menglong's career had been marked by an irregular visibility. Despite having early recognition and participating in relevant productions, his media presence seemed to fluctuate without a clear explanation. In the entertainment ecosystem, where exposure is usually carefully calculated, those absences generated retrospective suspicions. It was in that climate of revision when the image known as the black chair, associated with an artistic space, appeared. The photograph, dark and oppressive, showed a scene difficult to interpret in a unique way. There was no official confirmation regarding its context or the identity of the people appearing in it. However, its visual force provoked an immediate reaction. For a part of the public, it was not necessary to demonstrate its literal authenticity. The emotional resonance it produced was enough. The division of opinions was inevitable. One sector insisted on prudence, recalling that contemporary art frequently uses provocative images to generate reflection, not to document facts. Another group, on the other hand, held that the image should be read in light of a broader set of experiences attributed to the artist. In this clash of interpretations, they did not seek absolute truth so much as a way to express a concern accumulated over years. The conversation then acquired a transnational character. From communities of followers in Taiwan and Southeast Asia to users in Europe and America, the debate crossed linguistic and cultural borders. Commemoration ceremonies multiplied, and with them arose public petition initiatives claiming a deeper review of the case. The number of signatures grew day after day, not necessarily because everyone shared the same conclusions, but because they coincided in a feeling of nonconformity. This phenomenon revealed a recurring dynamic in the digital age. When institutions remain silent, the audience occupies that space with its own narratives. It is not solely about distrust, but about a need for participation. In the absence of clear answers, the community builds meanings from fragments, symbols, and parallels. The case of Yu Menglong thus became a canvas upon which broader concerns about power and vulnerability were projected. The appearance of the name Qiao Renliang intensified this dynamic. His inclusion in commemorative acts did not imply a direct equivalence of circumstances, but it did suggest a pattern that many considered disturbing. Old videos, artistic publications, and ambiguous statements were revisited with a new look. Every coincidence, real or perceived, reinforced the idea that certain stories had not been fully understood at the time. It is important to emphasize that this process was not free of criticism. Some observers warned about the risk of turning mourning into speculation, of confusing analysis with assertions. However, even these voices recognized a central element. The entertainment industry rarely offers sufficient transparency to completely dispel doubts. In that void, the collective imagination finds fertile ground. The emotional reaction was, in many cases, intense. Comments from followers expressed frustration, helplessness, and a sense of shared responsibility. It was not just about defending the memory of an artist, but about questioning a system perceived as asymmetrical. Fame, far from appearing as a shield, was shown as constant exposure to invisible pressures. This second level of the story reveals how an individual story can be transformed into a social mirror. The figure of Yu Menglong ceased to be solely that of a singer or actor, to become a symbol of something broader, the fragility of the individual in the face of structures that operate with their own logic. Every comment, every analysis, every signature added to a petition spoke less of certainties and more of a collective need for vigilance. At this point, the narrative reached a point of no return. It was no longer possible to reduce the conversation to an isolated anecdote or an exaggerated interpretation. The magnitude of the public response indicated that a sensitive nerve had been touched. The debate, with all its contradictions, exposed an uncomfortable truth. When too many people feel that something does not fit, the problem is rarely limited to a single name. Thus, the media avalanche not only amplified existing doubts, but prepared the ground for an even deeper question. If the reactions were so intense, what structures allowed these situations to be repeated? What power networks made it possible for an artist to change environments without really changing their destiny? The answer to these questions inevitably leads to the next level of analysis, where attention shifts from the individual to the system that surrounds them. The turning point of the debate arrived when attention ceased to concentrate on gestures, images, and symbolic interpretations to direct itself toward a more structural dimension. The question was no longer solely what Yu Menglong had experienced, but how it had been possible for his trajectory to develop within such a restrictive framework for so long. To answer it, many began to reconstruct his contractual and professional history with a broader gaze. Yu Menglong debuted in a competitive context, marked by talent shows that promise quick opportunities but usually impose long-term commitments. His first contract, signed in the early years of his career, linked him for a long period to an agency that controlled not only his work schedule but also his public exposure. At that time, as occurs with numerous young artists, the priority was to remain visible, even at the cost of yielding autonomy. The asymmetry of power was evident from the start. Over time, signs of friction arose. Attempts to redefine his professional direction, gestures interpreted as silent disagreements, and periods of irregular activity marked a stage of wear and tear. When one of his most extensive contracts finally concluded, the natural expectation would have been a relaunch. However, what followed was a period of almost total media disappearance, a silence that many interpreted as a form of professional freezing. This type of practice is not unknown in the entertainment industry. The so-called freezing of careers usually operates as an implicit warning. Those who challenge the established balance can be relegated to the margins. In the case of Yu Menglong, the prolonged absence of visible projects reinforced the perception that his room for maneuver was limited, even when, in theory, he had changed his work environment. The key to this apparent contradiction emerged when some analysts began to examine the ownership structures behind the different companies that had managed his career. What at first glance seemed like a change of agency was revealed under closer analysis as a reconfiguration within the same ecosystem of capital. Different companies, different names, but shareholding connections that led to the same core of power. This discovery significantly altered the reading of the case. If control was not exercised solely through a visible entity, but through a network of cross-shareholdings, the notion of contractual freedom acquired a new meaning. Changing companies did not necessarily imply changing conditions. For an artist, that structure could translate into the sensation of moving without advancing, of leaving one space only to enter another with similar limits. In this context, the statements of professionals in the sector acquired special weight. Some producers and directors pointed out that, despite Yu Menglong's commercial potential, his name rarely arose in the project planning stages. Not for lack of talent or public acceptance, but for decisions made at the management level. Visibility, in these cases, did not respond to artistic merit, but to internal strategies difficult to question from the outside. The recurring inclusion of the name of Qiao Renliang in these conversations reinforced the feeling of a pattern. It was not about affirming that both stories were identical, but about observing similarities in the general dynamic, promising careers, tensions with management structures, and a subsequent perception of isolation. The coincidence, for many, did not reside in the biographical details, but in the logic of the system that seemed to repeat itself. This is the most delicate point of the analysis. Talking about power structures does not imply attributing specific intentions nor constructing closed theories. It implies recognizing that, in highly concentrated industries, individual decisions are rarely completely free. Artists operate within frameworks that prioritize the stability of capital above personal well-being. When conflicts arise, they are usually resolved far from the public spotlight through mechanisms that leave no obvious traces. Yu Menglong's story, seen from this perspective, ceases to be an isolated case to become an example of systemic vulnerability. His figure symbolizes a generation of performers caught between the expectation of success and the reality of structural dependency. The shine of the stage contrasts with the opacity of the contracts, and the admiration of the public coexists with a lack of control over one's own professional destiny. The moment of greatest darkness, in this sense, is not a specific event, but a prolonged process. The gradual erosion of autonomy, the impossibility of making strategic decisions, and the constant pressure to meet others' expectations configure a scenario of silent wear and tear. There's not always a visible collapse. Sometimes the cost accumulates in the form of emotional fatigue, isolation, and resignation. The climax of this part of the story does not offer a clear resolution. It offers instead an awakening of awareness. Understanding the network of economic and political relationships surrounding an artist allows for contextualizing their actions and silences without reducing them to simplistic personal choices. It also forces a rethinking of the collective responsibility of an industry that benefits from youth and sensitivity, but rarely protects those who embody them. This analysis leads to an inevitable conclusion. As long as the structures remain intact, individual stories will continue to reproduce similar tensions. Yu Menglong's case does not respond solely to a series of unfortunate decisions, but to a system that normalizes the lack of transparency and the concentration of power. Recognizing this dimension does not resolve the pain nor offer immediate justice, but it does broaden the framework of understanding. With this level of clarity, the story approaches its denouement. It is no longer just about investigating what occurred, but about reflecting on what remains afterward. What kind of legacy emerges when a life becomes a question? And what responsibility does the public assume in deciding whether to observe in silence or to keep alive the critical memory that demands deeper changes? Upon reaching this point, the figure of Yu Menglong is no longer perceived solely as that of an artist whose life was extinguished prematurely. He's been transformed into an uncomfortable symbol, one that forces us to look beyond the spotlights and to question the very foundations of the entertainment industry. His absence left a void, but also a persistent question that refuses to disappear with the passage of time. The legacy that remains is not measured in awards or audience figures. It manifests, rather, in the capacity of his story to activate a collective reflection. The commemoration ceremonies, the minute reviews of old archives, and the transnational discussions do not seek to rewrite the past, but to understand it. In that shared effort lies a form of silent resistance against oblivion. From a broader perspective, this case highlights a reality that is rarely discussed openly. Fame, far from guaranteeing protection, can amplify vulnerability when combined with concentrated and opaque power structures. Extensive contracts, economic dependency, and the lack of oversight mechanisms create an environment where the individual is relegated in the face of the interests of the system. Yu Menglong was not the first to face these tensions, and everything indicates that he will not be the last. The recurring comparison with other artists does not intend to establish definitive equivalences. Its function is to evidence patterns, not to dictate closed conclusions. When multiple trajectories show similar signs of wear, silence, or isolation, the question ceases to be personal and becomes structural. What kind of industry has been normalized when human well-being is subordinated to the stability of capital? The deepest lesson of this story does not lie in the search for immediate culprits, but in shared responsibility. The public, the media, and the institutions themselves are part of an ecosystem that can choose between indifference or critical vigilance. Remembering is not a passive act. It is a way of demanding transparency and of rejecting the idea that certain losses are the inevitable price of success. Ultimately, the memory of Yu Menglong poses an ethical challenge. It reminds us that before being brands or assets, artists are people. People with limits, with fragilities, and with an inner life that does not always find space to express itself freely. Recognizing this does not weaken the industry. On the contrary, it confronts it with the need to evolve. The future of the story remains open. Perhaps all the answers will never be known. Maybe some truths will remain forever out of public reach. But the persistence of the conversation demonstrates that absolute silence is no longer an option. As long as there exists a community willing to observe, to question, and to remember, the moral debt will remain present. Thus, the name of Yu Menglong does not dissolve into statistics or into archives. It remains as a warning and as a call. A reminder that the light of the stage casts long shadows, and that only by looking at them head-on is it possible to imagine real change.